Marcus Bennett Saturday quietly in his first-class seat, flipping through the pages of a business report on his tablet. The gentle hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. It was a routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary, or so he thought. Dressed in a simple, yet impeccably tailored suit, Marcus could easily blend into any setting. He preferred it that way. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in the world, he had learned long ago that true power came from knowing when to stay invisible. But not today. It started when the flight attendant, Patricia, came down the aisle with the cart, her expression tight. She had been serving drinks and snacks to the passengers, moving briskly through the rows. As she approached Marcus, her eyes narrowed. He noticed the shift in her demeanor, the way her lips thinned and how she seemed to hesitate, as though she couldn't decide whether or not to address him. "Can I get a glass of water?" Marcus asked politely, glancing up from his tablet. Patricia's cold eyes swept over him. "Water," she repeated, as though the request were somehow offensive. Her voice had a harshness to it, laced with judgment. "Yes, just water, thank you," Marcus replied, smiling slightly, though he sensed something was off. She didn't move. Instead, Patricia stood there for a moment, staring at him as if evaluating whether he even belonged in first class. Marcus felt the weight of her gaze, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. He had encountered this look before, one that questioned his worth, his place in spaces that some thought weren't meant for him. A few seconds later, she huffed, turning her back on him without another word, wheeling the cart away without so much as a glance. Marcus blinked, his smile fading. He had seen it many times, racism, in its subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms, but it never ceased to sting. He sighed and returned to his tablet, choosing to ignore the slight. After all, he had business deals worth millions to close and a busy life waiting for him on the ground. But just as he began to lose himself in the charts and projections, Patricia reappeared. This time, she didn't bring water. Instead, she leaned over, her voice barely a whisper but dripping with venom. "Maybe you should move to the back. You don't seem like you belong up here," she sneered. Marcus looked up, stunned. The words took a moment to register, and when they did, a deep sense of anger and disbelief surged through him. He kept his calm, though, his heart racing. He had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, but this was different. "I paid for this seat," he replied evenly, his eyes locking with hers, just like everyone else. Patricia scoffed, her hands gripping the back of his seat. "I doubt that," she muttered under her breath. Marcus felt the tension rising in his chest, but he remained composed. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice controlled. Before she could answer, the passenger next to him, an older gentleman in a navy suit, leaned over. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Patricia. "He's right. He has every right to be here. There's no need for this." Patricia's face twisted with irritation. "Stay out of this," she snapped, glaring at the man. And then, without warning, she did the unthinkable. Her hand flew through the air, landing a sharp slap across Marcus's face. The cabin went silent. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus Saturday there, stunned, the sting of the slap still fresh on his cheek. He couldn't believe what had just happened. A flight attendant turned employee of the airline had struck him, for no other reason than the color of his skin and the fact that she didn't think he belonged in first class. Around him, other passengers began to stir, murmurs of shock and outrage filling the air. The man beside him stood up, his voice rising. "This is outrageous. I saw what you did, and I won't stand for it." Patricia looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. Her confident sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But before anyone could say more, another flight attendant appeared, followed by the captain, alerted by the commotion in the cabin. "What's going on here?" the captain demanded, his stern gaze sweeping across the scene. Marcus, still calm despite the situation, slowly stood. He turned to Patricia, his face unreadable. "This flight attendant struck me for no reason," he said, his voice measured. "I don't want to cause a scene, but I won't tolerate this kind of behavior." Patricia's face went pale as the captain's gaze fell on her. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. She stammered, trying to explain herself, but the words came out tangled and confused. The passengers around them began to speak up, confirming what had happened. The captain's frown deepened, and he turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I deeply apologize for this. I assure you, we will handle this situation appropriately." But before Marcus could respond, a sharp voice interrupted. "Do you even know who this man is?" It was the older gentleman, the one who had initially defended Marcus. He stood, glaring at Patricia. "This is Marcus Bennett, one of the wealthiest men in the world. He could buy this entire airline if he wanted to." A ripple of disbelief passed through the cabin. Patricia's eyes widened as the full weight of her actions sank in. Marcus Bennett, the billionaire entrepreneur, philanthropist, and media mogul, the man whose face graced magazines and television screens around the world. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she had done. Marcus, however, remained composed. He wasn't one for public outbursts or grand displays of power. Instead, he met Patricia's gaze and said, "I don't need you to treat me differently because of my wealth. I just need to be treated like everyone else with respect." The captain nodded solemnly. "Sir, we will escort her off the plane at the next stop. You have my deepest apologies." Patricia, now trembling, was led away, her world crashing down around her. As the doors to the cabin closed behind her, the other passengers settled back into their seats, the air still thick with tension. Marcus sat her day down quietly, the sting of the slap still lingering, but it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the reminder that, no matter how successful or powerful he became, there would always be those who saw him as less. As the plane hummed back to a steady quiet, Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring out of the window at the dark expanse of sky. The chaos of the last hour still echoed in his mind, but he pushed it aside, knowing this was not the time or place to dwell on it. He had long since grown accustomed to facing challenges others couldn't imagine, and this was just one more in a line of injustices he had learned to navigate. The other passengers shot him furtive glances, some filled with sympathy, others with disbelief. The man who had stood up for him earlier gave him a nod of respect, acknowledging the grace with which Marcus had handled the situation. Marcus nodded back, appreciating the support, even though he never asked for it. He wasn't here to make a scene, to flex his wealth, or to shame anyone. He just wanted respect, like any other human being. And yet, time and time again, people like Patricia reminded him that no matter how far he had come, there was always someone ready to knock him down. As he resumed his work on the tablet, a soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, Mr. Bennett." It was another flight attendant, her face pale and her eyes filled with remorse. She was young, likely new to the job, and looked as if she had just witnessed something that shook her to the core. "I'm terribly sorry for what happened earlier," she said, her voice shaking. I want you to know that we're all appalled by what Patricia did. That's not who we are, not what we stand for. If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Marcus appreciated the gesture, though he could sense the discomfort in her voice. She was likely sent by the captain to smooth things over, to ensure that Marcus didn't pursue the issue any further. He could tell she meant well, but the apology felt rehearsed, a band-aid over a much deeper wound. "Thank you," he said, his tone even. "I just want to get through this flight in peace." She nodded, offering a strained smile before disappearing back down the aisle. Marcus watched her go, the tension in his chest slowly easing. It wasn't her fault, and he knew it. She was just trying to do her job, and he didn't want to make things harder for anyone else. For the next few hours, the flight went on without incident. Marcus kept to himself, ignoring the occasional whispers and curious stares from the other passengers. He had dealt with much worse in his life and had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, but something about this incident lingered with him. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt his phone buzz. It was his assistant, Jonathan, who had already gotten wind of the incident. "Jonathan, Mr. Bennett, I just heard what happened on the flight. Do you want me to make a statement? The media's going to pick this up quickly, I'm sure." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He could already imagine the headlines: "Billionaire slapped by racist flight attendant scandal in the skies." It was the kind of story that would go viral in seconds, but it was the last thing he wanted to deal with. "Marcus, no. Jonathan, I don't want to make this a spectacle. Handle it quietly. Make sure the airline knows we're not going to let this slide, but I don't want my name plastered all over the news." Jonathan, understood. I'll make some calls and take care of it. If you change your mind about the statement, let me know. Marcus smiled slightly. Jonathan was good at his job, always knowing how to navigate situations like this with finesse. The plane touched down smoothly, and as the passengers began to disembark, Marcus remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. He could feel the tension in the air as people passed him, some offering quiet nods of respect, others pretending not to have noticed the earlier scene at all. When the cabin was nearly empty, Marcus stood, grabbing his briefcase. He moved slowly, letting the moment settle, his mind still processing the day's events. He had long ago learned the importance of choosing battles, and while today had been difficult, it wasn't a fight he intended to wage in public. He had bigger things to focus on. As he made his way toward the exit, he spotted the captain standing by the door, waiting for him. The older man's face was etched with concern and regret. "Mr. Bennett," the captain began, his voice heavy, "I want to personally apologize for what happened. I assure you that Patricia's actions do not reflect our airline's values, and she has been dealt with accordingly." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but distant. "I appreciate that, Captain. I'm not looking for retribution, but this shouldn't have happened. It's 2024, and people shouldn't be treated this way, no matter who they are." The captain's face tightened, and he nodded. "You're absolutely right. We'll be conducting a full review of our staff and policies to ensure this doesn't happen again. Thank you for your understanding." With a polite nod, Marcus stepped off the plane, feeling the cool rush of airport air hit his face. As he walked through the terminal, his phone buzzed again, this time with messages from friends, colleagues, and the media, all wanting to know what had happened. He ignored them for now. There would be time to address it later, in his own way, but for now, Marcus just wanted to focus on what really mattered, using his influence to make sure that no one, no matter their wealth, race, or background, had to endure what he had today. Because while Patricia may have seen him as just another face to scorn, Marcus knew his true value, and that was something no slap could ever take away. As Marcus walked through the terminal, the buzz of airport life seemed distant, a low hum behind the thoughts that swelled in his mind. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people might expect. Marcus had long learned to turn his anger into something more powerful action. He knew that wealth could bring comfort, but it was influence that brought change. Outside the terminal, his car was already waiting. Marcus climbed into the back seat, his assistant Jonathan sitting up front, tapping away on his tablet. The moment the door closed, Jonathan turned to face him. "I spoke to the airline's CEO," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. "They're issuing a formal apology and offering compensation, though I told them that's not what we're after. I've also arranged for a meeting with the diversity and training team to discuss how they can better educate their staff on these issues." Marcus nodded, leaning back against the seat. "Good. I don't want this to just be a headline. I want it to mean something." Jonathan smiled, his admiration for Marcus clear. "I figured you'd say that. I'll make sure they take real steps, not just lip service." For a moment, Marcus stared out the window as the car pulled away from the airport. The cityscape blurred by, and as he watched, he thought about how many others had been in his position, people who weren't billionaires, who couldn't use their status to demand accountability. What happened to them? Did their voices get lost in the noise, forgotten by a system that so often overlooked them? The thought stirred something in him, a familiar resolve. This wasn't just about him, it never had been. He had the platform, the resources, and the power to ensure this wasn't just another forgotten incident. If his experience could spark a broader change, he would do everything in his power to make sure it did. "Jonathan," Marcus said after a long pause, "I want to fund a campaign." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A campaign?" "Yeah," Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum, "not just against this airline, but something bigger. We'll partner with organizations that focus on diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism training in corporate spaces. We'll work with industries that still have these blind spots. This kind of discrimination shouldn't be happening anywhere, let alone on a flight where people are supposed to feel safe." Jonathan nodded, his fingers already moving to take notes. "I'll get in touch with our legal and PR teams, see how we can get the ball rolling." Marcus smiled slightly, feeling a sense of satisfaction. This was his way turning adversity into action, taking a personal moment of pain and transforming it into something that could help others. He had always believed that with great power came the responsibility to use it for the greater good, and this moment was no different. As the car weaved through the traffic, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a friend in the media world, asking for a statement. Jonathan turned, reading the look on Marcus's face. "You want to make a public comment, or should we stick to handling this quietly?" Jonathan asked, knowing Marcus preferred to keep his private life out of the spotlight. For a moment, Marcus considered the options. He could easily stay silent, let Jonathan handle everything behind the scenes, and quietly move on with his life. But he knew this wasn't just about him. If he stayed silent, how many others would face the same injustice? How many more stories would go untold? "No," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "Let's make a statement, but not about the slap. This isn't about what you did to me. It's about what we can do to stop this from happening to anyone else." Jonathan smiled approvingly. "Got it. I'll draft something thoughtful, focused on solutions rather than the incident." As the car pulled up to Marcus's high-rise apartment, he stepped out, feeling the weight of the day lifting slightly. He wasn't a man to hold grudges, and while Patricia's actions had been reprehensible, he knew that the best way to respond wasn't through anger or revenge. It was through change. Marcus stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the glittering city below. In the distance, the lights flickered like stars scattered across the skyline. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, how he had risen from humble beginnings, facing countless challenges and prejudices along the way, only to emerge stronger. This was just another chapter in that journey, another moment that reminded him why he fought so hard to be where he was, not for the wealth, not for the accolades, but for the power to shape a better world. As the cool breeze brushed against his face, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't going to let this experience define him. Instead, he would define the change that followed. Back inside, Jonathan was already typing up a statement, ready to send it out to the media. Marcus glanced at the screen, nodding approvingly at the words that focused on unity, respect, and the need for real reform. He knew this statement would reach millions, but more importantly, it would start conversations in boardrooms and homes across the world. And Patricia, she would likely never forget that moment on the plane, the slap that had set this all in motion. But for Marcus, it wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about creating a world where no one else had to endure what he had. As he Saturday down in his office, the weight of the day finally settling, Marcus allowed himself one small moment of satisfaction. He had faced racism, cruelty, and ignorance, and yet, here he was still standing, still thriving. And now, he would make sure the world learned from this moment, not just for him, but for everyone.